Hey guys, how's it going? Another great week. Let's jump into it. So, we've already talked about strategy. So, there's the history and definition of strategy. Um, there's a cameo from a dog walking in the background. Components of strategy, such as resources, objectives, so what you have and what you want to do. And then modern US strategy and its limitations. So, lots of natural resources, but a limitation is that they're not always used very effectively. I believe there was an F-35 shot over Iran either last week or the week before. That shouldn't be happening to F-35, so it's a great example. Beyond that, we have threat. So what is threat? We talked about the definition, threat and war, economic threat, sanctions and their processes, and the utility, or how you use threat. What we didn't get to talk a ton about, because it's safe for later, is what happens when you don't follow through on your threats. But that's a conversation for another day. So for threat, we're going to go very quickly over what we mean by threat, what it looks like in war, although we've talked about that quite a bit, so we're not going to dwell on that too long. Economic threat, specifically sanctions and their processes, and then the utility of threat, or how states, mainly the United States, uses threat in foreign policy processes. The main difference between a threat and a warning is that a threat is a stated intention to harm. So do X or I'm going to do Y. Where a warning is more passive and less specific. If you don't do X, Y is going to happen. Today we'll be focusing on the United Nations, so its background, the role today, how the US interacts with it, and then different effects and criticism of the United Nations. So for the background, we do have to announce that yes, I am back on my bullshit. What is my bullshit, you may ask? Well, it's not the year 2008 today. It's not the Vietnam War today. It's World War One and its aftermath. So, of course, we talked about how World War One is sort of the dying legacies of relevance, especially among European nobility, and then drags the world literally into trench warfare and all sorts of not nice things. So one of the legacies of World War One is the League of Nations, and it starts off with a pretty decent idea. Overall, what it is to increase the amount of cooperation because that has two big effects. One is very explicit ways to resolve disputes. There's this international community that can adjudicate or be the judges of who's in the right, who's in the wrong with different disputes. The second one is even if they're not resolving disputes, this increased information from communication attacks the information problem. So, two states are having a dispute. They're not going to be able to resolve it through debate or anything like that within the United Nations. They're still less likely to go to war because they know more about each other and they know who's more likely to win the war. So the loser is less likely to engage in war, thereby creating this system where they're going to be more conciliatory and there's going to be less violence overall. That's the idea. Now, as we discussed, the weird irony behind the League of Nations is that it was really the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson. So then president, he was president during most of World War One, if not all of it. But because of how the U.S. works, he needs congressional approval to sign a treaty like this, and he has a stroke and is not able to really make his case, even if there was a chance for it to be made within Congress. His wife, Edith Wilson, tries to carry the torch as much as he can, He's severely disabled at this point. He doesn't live for much long after his presidency. Edith Wilson does her best to champion it, but it ends up not working. And despite being the brainchild of the United States, the League of Nations never actually has the United States as a member. And on one hand, it kind of makes sense that a lot of the Great War, people didn't know there was another World War coming, so they thought, well, this is a very unfortunate time in history. We're hoping to move past it, get out of all the chaos that is European politics, all these grievances, which is a cause of war, these grievances that go back hundreds of years. Um, let's just stay in our hemisphere. That's one of the overall thought processes that go to it. And the other interesting one that people don't really talk about is that the debate whether or not to join the League of Nations was heavily influenced by the women vote. Um, Women get the right to suffrage in 1919, and the League of Nations, or the presidency to help determine whether or not the U.S. joins the League of Nations is in 1920. Now, if you ever watch Boardwalk Empire, which takes place around that time, women are talking about getting the right to vote, and then the male characters in the show will often demean them. Well, what do you think about the League of Nations? Um, and of course, most people at the time, not just women, but most people didn't have much of an opinion on the League of Nations, focusing on other stuff. Point being is that as women come into power or gain the right of suffrage, they're not really focused on international issues like that because no one is, but now there's this greater block of people who are more focused on domestic issues. Because at the same time, you have the Roaring Twenties trying to regulate the economy, prohibition, and the Volstead Act, all these different domestic issues going on in the United States that voters are more focused on that, and women voters especially are, I would say, generally more practical and focused on what's going on in their own communities. And this whole push for a return to normal is what ends up winning Warren G. Harding the election after Wilson serves his time. And he's carried heavily by the women's vote, but not because, and I put the sticker on his jacket as a joke, because he wasn't overtly feminist or pandering toward women. It was this idea of return to normal. So not necessarily isolationist, but we've gotten all this World War I unpleasantness out of the way. Let's try to return to normal and then go back to living the good life. Or to put it in Gen Z terminology, he said, no cap, let's go back to normal. I'm being dead ass. I just had a free use of an AI and I didn't know what else to use it on, so I did my best to give him Gen Z hair. And a lot of people look at this as a big failure of the U.S., but a big modern complaint people have about the U.S. is that it's too involved in international politics. Um, so to a certain extent, you're not going to make anybody happy. To The original point, though, is that if the U.S. had been more involved, there might have been a chance that World War II would not have broken out or been as deadly. Now, if you remember my lecture on the Middle East borders and um, what an absolute mess that is, that's related to this whole idea of U.S. isolationism at the time. Not just the League of Nations, but also the Treaty of Versailles and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where most of the world is being carved up at a foundational level, what a semi-foundational level, I guess we can say, by people who really don't understand the rest of the world. So, with the maps of the Middle East not really matching people who like to live in the same country, whereas different ethnic groups will live right across the border in another country, but they'll relate to somebody or another group of people more. That's because the people who drew those lines, especially after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, just didn't know what they were doing. Um, so you have that whole mindset of people within the League of Nations, within Sykes-Picot, within Treaty of Versailles, who ultimately set the world up for failure for very petty reasons. And we've talked about this before. I know is that's why I don't like to refer to World War II as World War II all the time, but more as like a continuation of World War One, because the post World War One peace was so poorly formed. And that's without even going into how poorly the post-German peace was formed. So to review, that is characterized by Germany paying war debts, and it has to use the infinite money printer to pay these debts, so it ends up destroying the German economy. And then people get really upset about that and then form the German Workers' Party. Now, the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles either didn't read or didn't understand the art of war, because there's no one of the maxims in it is uh, don't surrender an enemy from four sides or leave an outlet free. Um, the idea is that someone who's desperate is going to fight harder, and Germany was desperate because of this, and so it leads to this metastasized version of Germany. And we talked about how all the different borders and everything are drawn by people who don't really understand the ethnic groups that live inside and outside the borders. So some of them are cracked, some of them are packed. Um, well, if you've ever talked to someone from Germany, you know that there's tons of different ethnic groups within Germany, um, mostly upper and lower Germany, but Bavarians, Austrians, all these different groups of people that are also packed in together to a state that they didn't necessarily agree to, especially without German leadership. I mean, the only person who was ever able to do it before was Bismarck. So Germany set up in this horrible situation, heavily by the international community is the point. And when people get desperate, they get, I wouldn't say stupid, but their judgment goes off and they start believing in terrible things. In this case, one of the worst things, the not so nice guys that I don't know if I can talk about if I'm making this into a YouTube video also. But the 1930s and 40s Germany people. Now, what's really odd about this is that like World War II is a result of the quote unquote international community failing Germany, leading to this white supremacist movement. I would say the biggest scale white supremacist movement of all time. But what a lot of them are actually rallying against is leadership by a mostly white, Western European, male, or in some cases like Slavic, or I don't know if Russians are technically considered Slavs. But they're not actually being led by the international community, which is sort of a weird thought. But the League of Nations, which, like we discussed, only really has one job, is to prevent another world war, it fails at the first hurdle. It doesn't exist very long until the war breaks out. So often attributed beginning of World War II. There have been conflicts and stuff before this, so sort of what historians have agreed on is 1939. So not long after the founding of the League of Nations, it's already failed. So for the rest of the war, it hangs on sort of vestigial, like an appendix or something like that, where people don't really pay attention to it, but people really, it only exists because people haven't paid attention to it. So 1946, they've already formed the United Nations at this point, and they dissolved the League of Nations. And sometimes the idea is good, but the execution is bad. And that was overall the whole foundational idea behind founding the UN, or United Nations, was um, overall the benefits of having the League of Nations. So increased cooperation and increased communication to reduce violence. They're all there, but then they just sort of pitch it as, what if it's the League of Nations but done more competently? What if we learn from our mistakes, aside from trying to abandon this whole international organization idea before it really gets a chance to catch wind? And that's more or less what happens. The United Nations is founded in 1945. League of Nations is disbanded a year later. And the main difference between the two is, of course, the involvement of the United States. And this isn't to say or not say that the United States is some sort of moral leader above this, but given with what a catastrophic failure the League of Nations was, it was this idea that leadership in the international community actually has to be representative of the international community. So it can't just be a bunch of Western European diplomats anymore. Now, part of that is reflected on where the UN building is located now, New York, New York. And importantly, is outside the building, all the member states have flags flying at the same height. We'll expand more on this in a second, but instead of being explicitly about states telling other states what to do, it's this idea of equality between states. And then, of course, it does end up in states telling other states what to do a lot of the time. But there's at least a baseline level of mutual respect and equality between the states, even if it's just ceremonial. And this is the just first chart that came up in 2015, but I imagine it's very consistent through the years. One of the main states funding the United Nations is the United States, even to this day. Part of that is the sort of deal we talked about, where the U.S. agrees to fund more, especially in terms of security, because it likes not having to argue with other states about security. So if the U.S. funds a ton of security, then it doesn't have to debate security either. It can just act more unilaterally. So the three main parts about the UN we're going to talk about are the UN General Assembly, or UNGA, the UN Security Council, or UNSC, and then the others that don't really have their own identity, or just don't have an identity that really compares to the importance of the General Assembly or Security Council. So the General Assembly is exactly what it sounds like. It's where all the members of the United Nations meet and deliberate. Now, I just said meet and deliberate, and I haven't even said about what, but we're already at a roadblock of controversy with that. And yet, Mr. Beast being a great example of that. I don't watch his videos. I'm a bit too old for them, but I do remember a few years ago there was a big stink when he had, I think it was like one contestant or two contestants from every country competing in one of his videos. And that's where things got already very hairy. Now, this isn't all of it. This is just half of the countries he recognized for this video. But by drawing all these borders as to what Mr. Beast considered what was and wasn't a country, kicked off a big international stink because some people had thought that he had recognized places that should be countries but weren't on his map. Other places recognized, like, hey, that's not actually a country. Why are you recognizing their independence? So stuff like that. So it caused off this big stink, even though it was just a YouTube video for kids. Um, so if this is just a YouTube video for kids that causes off this huge stink, then what do you think the United Nations, like an actual international organization that has millions and hundreds of millions in funding, um, when they say what is and isn't a country? So currently, the United Nations recognizes somewhere around 190 states to be countries. And why this is important is because as a member of the United Nations, you have to, or at least you're expected to, recognize these as countries also. And so there's a few places here, or there's a few places that claim to be states that aren't on this because the UN either they're not members of the UN or they want to be members of the UN and they just don't have recognition from the UN as actual countries. Two states that are missing from that are considered states but are not members of the United Nations. They have something called non-member status, are states that explicitly either don't want to be or can't be involved in the UN. So the one on the left here is the Holy See, which is the more formal title of the Vatican. And then on the right is Palestine, is seen as a non, or is recognized as a non-member state of the United Nations. And this can and cannot upset different independence movements. There was this whole push in 2014 on more Ukrainian independence and recognition at the UN. And then there's like actual separatist movements or independence movements like the Basques in Spain. So this is the top right. Um, the Basque region of Spain is sort of famous for being mountainous and isolated from basically the rest of Europe, much like Switzerland. And they speak their own language and they have their own unique spelling conventions and stuff. So it doesn't even really look like most other European languages. So there's a movement to be their own sort of a state that may or may not even be part of the European Union. But this group is from the ETA. I don't know what it stands for. My Basque isn't very good. In fact, it's non-existent. But I believe they were a terrorist group that was really active back in like the 70s. Some more visible ones that you'll see are Scottish independence, which has gotten really close to happening a few times, but has never quite been able to come through. My favorite fact about Scottish independence, and nobody believes this when I say it, and then they end up looking it up and it's 100% real. The same way the animal for Wales is that red dragon on their flag, the animal for the UK is the lion. I believe for Spain it's the bull. Of course, for America it's the bald eagle. The animal for Scotland is the unicorn, like in the magical creature with a horn on its head. That's always very funny to me. Um, Another big independence movement, though, so a place that wants to be its own country but isn't, is Quebec of all places. Often there's a resolution to have Quebec become its own country. It makes sense to a certain extent. It is French Canada, um, but they've just never really been able to crack that nut either. So some more roles of the General Assembly, other than recognizing what is and isn't a country, can be budgeting for the rest of the United Nations. So the different subcommittees, we'll talk about the different funds and stuff like that. Security Council, of course, being a big one we're about to talk about. Another one is shaping norms, or and this is a lot through resolutions, or the UN taking a vote to decide whether or not the international community is mad about something, which sounds very silly, But it does have an effect on international reputation if you've got the UN constantly condemning you for how you treat women, minorities, LGBT people. Um, so it actually does matter. And there's elections for other roles, so how to set up these other funds and different committees. And then if there is gridlock in the Security Council, the General Assembly, through some pretty esoteric rules, can influence Security Council decisions. So a big part of what the UN does is establish norms. So you'd expect this like very bloated bureaucratic system to have very explicit goals and stuff like that, but that's not necessarily the case. And a lot of what it tries to do is influence this through unwritten rules and policy. Um, Great example of that. Heading to Mongolia in a few weeks. So I've been looking up on like different things that are and are not offensive in Mongolia because I don't want to offend anyone, even if by accident. And so you look up like what's offensive in Mongolia, and it's like don't throw stuff at people, don't touch strangers in the head, and stuff like that. So stuff that doesn't really have to be written as a rule because it's all very normal. It's just something you kind of know. Another great example of norms is talking in movie theaters. Even if the movie theater, most of them have a rule against it now, but back in the day they didn't. And even then, the rule's not often enforced. But people used to talk in movie theaters all the time, and it was very annoying until it became more normalized. That's just like something you don't do. It was like more like mid 2000s when cell phones just came out. So it's this logic of appropriateness, or like what is just sort of a very basic thing that a state would do. So some common norms are avoiding war, not 100% against war, but taking steps to avoid it if you can. A norm within the United Nations is this equality of states. So it's similar to how every state in the U.S. gets the same amount of senators. Every different state, but every country in the UN um, General Assembly has the same weight behind their vote. It doesn't matter if it's St. Kitts or India, so the highest population or one of the lowest populations. Same weight to their vote. Human rights, responsibility to protect, and then self-determination. Now, as we said, it's avoidance of war, not swearing off war, because you can't do everything, and it just sort of expects you to do your best to avoid war. And this is obviously because the League of Nations prevented to stop World War II, and the United Nations is sort of almost a reform or second try at the League of Nations because of this. Knock on wood, there hasn't been a World War III yet. Hopefully there never will be. And who knows if the United Nations would survive a World War III because of that. And like we talked about with the General Assembly, excuse the pun, but generally, on the voting floor, states are seen as equal. So it doesn't matter if you are India with the highest population, if Luxembourg and St. Kitts vote the other way, then your vote is not only canceled out, but you've lost more. Of course, the trade-off is that India has more ability to influence votes because it has a bigger population and bigger economy. Even if the bigger states do tend to have more unofficial influence, there's debate on whether or not proportional representation should be respected more even formally. Like within the United States, we had the Great Compromise. So every state has the same amount of senators, but not the same amount of representatives, and that's based on population. And another big one that the UN sets as a big goal is human rights. So it made a universal declaration of human rights. which you'll not be surprised to find out is not as explicit as people would like as to what is and isn't a human right, but it's a good first step. What I mean by this gray area on what is and isn't a human right is a lot of states aren't going to agree with um, gender equality, equality for LGBT people or LGBTQ people. Democracy is a pretty big one, whether or not the right to that kind of representation in government is actually a human right. So the UN has to make a lot of concessions as to what is and isn't a human right, but defining them like that is a good first step. And avoiding stuff like the Holocaust is, I think we could all agree, an admirable goal. Unfortunately, it's not one that they always meet. And there's something admirable about, almost like the Olympics, but all these countries banding together to protect human rights. Even if they don't always get it, if you excuse the pun, even if they don't always get it right, there is, I think, a very decent goal to do that, at least on the base level. Now, how it's implemented, people can have different disputes on, but or even what rights are human rights and what rights aren't, is a matter of no small debate. But this idea that the international community is going to come together and work together to prevent abuses of broadly defined human rights, it can be kind of cool when you think about it like that. Now, one of these rights is self-determination. The reason I include Ukraine on this photo montage or these four examples is not because Ukraine isn't a country. It is a country recognized by the UN and the vast majority of the international community. It's just borders aren't really respected by one majorly powerful country in the United Nations, Russia. So how the UN litigates that is very interesting. Condemnation, isolation from Russia and the international community. But that really goes back into the sanctions conversation that we had last week. But what's, I think, even more interesting is this idea of where does self-determination end? So let's use Scotland as an example, or the United Kingdom as an example. Give it a second and think about what makes up the United Kingdom specifically. What different nations? If you said the English, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish, you would be correct. At least I believe you would be correct. It's not my forte. But why is the United Kingdom a state but not Scotland? Some would say, oh, Scotland's too small. There's much smaller countries in the United Nations than Scotland. So at what point does self-determination end? Same with Quebec, same with the Basque region of Spain. And what gets really interesting is okay, let's say we give them all their independence. Well, to stick with the Scotland metaphor, there's all sorts of different clans within Scotland. The only one that I can really think of is Macduff, but all these different smaller family groups. Well, why not make them all their own countries too? And then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to the smallest level possible, which is the individual claiming to be not part of any state or their own independent state, which is like a super libertarian dream. No smoke on libertarians, of course, but the sovereign citizen movement is what this leads to. So it's like with this, a lot of sovereign citizens now claim that U.S. law doesn't apply to them because they're their own country, which is not how that works. Point being, why we're talking about this though, is at what point does self-determination run out? When are you a state and when are you not a state is heavily debated, and the UN, of course, doesn't have a perfect answer to that. It just does its best in a way that will work for all the members. All right, I grew up with the OG Xbox and the Xbox 360. So whenever I see UNSC, I think about the United Nations Space Command, which is not a real thing. That's the organization that you fight for in the video game series called Halo, which is sort of the flagship for the Xbox franchise or for the Xbox system a long time. It's fallen off pretty hard in recent years. So mentally, I have to tell myself, oh yeah, the UNSC is a real thing. It's just not the United Nations Space Command. It's the United Nations Security Council. Now, the United Nations Security Council is the most powerful part of the UN. Its primary goal is to promote peace, so security, but it can authorize use of force that the UN, by its nature, automatically approves of. So a big example of that was the coalition forces in the Korean War. People often think, and no, I've probably dispelled this notion in this class at this point, but a lot of people think that the Korean War was the US and South Korea versus North Korea. And China sort of left out of the conversation, but China was a big part of the Korean War too, where that's not the case. It was China and North Korea, and to an extent, the Soviet Union against the United Nations. The 2001 Gulf, or 1991 Gulf War, UN gave authorization for also. It did not give authorization for the Iraq invasion, though. So that's 2003. I believe France vetoed it, and that's what kicked off a lot of anti-French. The word meme didn't exist yet, but like you weren't supposed to call them French fries, you're supposed to call them freedom fries. Obviously, that didn't last. And it can impose sanctions, but as we discussed, sanctions are more effective as threats than actual policies. And then peacekeeping operations, which are different than authorized use of force. So within the Security Council, it's made up of the 5 major allies that won World War II. And you can track the history of why that is pretty easily. So Germany, Japan, Italy are not members of the Security Council, despite being economic powerhouses. So the 5 biggest allies of World War II were China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. Except Russia didn't exist yet, it was the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union collapses and Russia takes its spot in 91. And the other 10 seats rotate. So these 5 permanent members, as I said, USA, China, there's an asterisk there, France, the UK, Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. But their main thing is they have veto power. So they can shut down anything the UNSC does, the drop of a hat, which I'm sure sounded like a great idea in 1945 because they were all on the same side, except the Soviet Union and China. Well, at the time, China was nationalist, so we'll just say the Soviet Union by itself. There's going to be some give and take that will actually probably give it more legitimacy if even from the rest of the world's perspective, if even the Soviets can agree on it, then it must be true. As time goes on, interests diverge. The Cold War happens very quickly after. So it doesn't have a lot of power now in regulating the developed world because China and Russia tend to be on one side of that, where the US, France, and the UK tend to be on the other side. But it still does get a lot done. We talked about with the League of Nations, basically all the power behind it and all the effective power was from Western and Northern Europe. So to combat that within the UNSC, there was a geographic requirement. So it's 10 rotating members by geography to have more diversity within the perspectives. So Eastern Europe is allocated 1 seat. Africa gets 3, which Africa has the most, but it still seems kind of low considering I believe a quarter of all countries are in Africa. somewhere around that. Asia Pacific have 2 seats. Latin America and the Caribbean get 2 seats, and then Western Europe is sort of lumped in with other getting 2 seats. Talking about how foreign policy is not exactly, um, a lot of it does happen behind closed doors, a lot of it is unofficial. Um, there's this famous study that so they looked at the seats on the UN Security Council and found that once you get your spot on there, you get a huge increase in foreign aid and all these different investments and stuff like that, um, because it's countries essentially trying to bribe members of the UNSC. Now, would never accuse of a state acting on those bribes, but they certainly take them. So what we can say is that rotating on to the UN Security Council for no reason at all, definitely not bribery. Like I said, I would never accuse a state of that. So we'll say for no reason at all of a sudden makes a state more attractive to investment. Um, Similar to how a lot of guys who win the lottery end up meeting the quote unquote love of their life just a few days later. So going back to the Korean War though, because I'm dedicated to talking about any war other than World War II apparently. Um, but it's a big UN action in the early 1950s, remembered in the US, of course, as the Forgotten War. So it's remembered as the Forgotten War and some sort of weird pun. Um, but what's interesting about that is that China was fighting on the other side of this. Now, those of you who are very perceptive, which is of course all of you, are thinking, hold up, Paul. China has veto power on the Security Council. How was that possible? That UN states and a UN coalition could fight against a member or a state with veto power on the Security Council. Well, that's where it gets quite interesting. Not necessarily about the Korean War, but about the U.S. and really the whole world's relationship with China. And to be clear, aside from the South Korean leadership, this was mostly the U.S. fighting against North Korea and China. Um, the Soviet Union helped materially, but not really in terms of people there, and it didn't veto for other reasons. But how did any of this happen if China had veto power? Well, at the time, China was not the People's Republic of China, it was the Republic of China, um, which is better known as Taiwan now. So 1949, the Chinese Civil War ends, and the nationalist forces in the Republic of China are forced to Taiwan. And so Taiwan actually maintained the UN veto power until 1971, where uh, they introduced Resolution 2758. Now, what this ultimately did was argue that Taiwan is not representative of the majority of Chinese people. So the UN Security Council seat should be given to the well established by this point. This is 1971. The war ended in 49. People's Republic of China. A lot of states were for it. A lot of states were against it. But that's how the Korean War was able to happen without a Chinese veto. And I think that giving it to somebody else in that way is really the only way to get somebody off the Security Council. So if there's a state anybody wants to get off the Security Council, that's how to do it. So that leads into this whole debate about self-determination, right? even if Taiwan isn't representative of the majority of Chinese people, does that mean it loses its status as a state? According to the UN, it does. According to the UN, Taiwan is part of China, but according to certain UN members, namely the United States, Taiwan is an independent country. Um, who's to say? Well, that's really a big debate that there's no real one authority that can solve it. Um, Taiwan wants to be independent. Sure, why not let Quebec or Scotland or sovereign citizens just go around without driver's licenses? I don't have a good answer to any of that. It's food for thought. You might expect me to be on the whole side of Taiwan belongs to China, but I really don't care in this case. Then I made this category as like other because there's so many different funds and initiatives from the United Nations. There's like UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are identify like culturally significant architectural findings. Um, and then like UNICEF, as pictured here, the United Nations Children Fund, promoting like health and development among children all over the world. In 2017, 28, well, it wasn't 20, like 2018, 2019 maybe, Greta Thunberg sort of became a meme with her whole "How dare you" speech in reference to the climate change at the UN. So different things that the world community benefits to cooperate on for solving. So childhood poverty. I haven't met anyone who's for childhood poverty, um, or who's been openly for childhood poverty, because it's sort of one of those things everyone can agree is a bad thing. People debate whether or not climate change exists or not, but it does, by the way. But it's something that we all benefit from cooperating on together. Now, as a man, I can't speak for this, but I imagine in 2014, women all throughout the world suddenly felt more empowered and independent because the UN put Emma Watson as their goodwill ambassador to women. It's a joke, being sarcastic, of course. This is a big criticism of the UN, is that a lot of it can be performative. Um, Emma Watson, of course, privately educated, the 1% of the 1%, even before she got into acting. I don't know what benefit she's going to bring towards microloans for Pakistani women starting their own businesses. So you can say that there's some sort of element of ceremony or some benefit to the ceremony, and I think that's valid, but I'm just not sure if it helps as much as people or as much as it hurts. Like I talked about, there's a UNESCO, which, in addition to other things, has these World Heritage sites and recognizes that certain, especially ancient artifacts, are super important to the collective human world heritage and provides resources and funding to keep them preserved. Some examples are Petra, top left in Jordan. Um, then Stonehenge, of course, in the UK. There's the Great Wall of China was too obvious, so I put up the Great Wall of Pakistan. And then sometimes there's a case right now that the entire Gobi Desert in Mongolia be declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I only put it up because my friend there is working on that. So big criticism of the UN. Um, One, of course, resolutions or the setting of norms often doesn't have teeth, especially if the Security Council doesn't want to participate. So what will happen a lot of the time is just the UN, the joke that's been done to death, will send a quote unquote strongly worded letter if you don't, straighten up and fly right. Where this gets to be a problem, though, especially is that the United Nations, one of the founding principles behind it was the aftermath of the Holocaust. There's this whole idea that never again is what people said after the Holocaust. I don't know anyone who's for the Holocaust, of course, and I would hope that none of you are, or anything similar to the Holocaust. And so never again was something that was almost universally agreed upon, especially in the UN. I think it was universally agreed upon. And if it's something that we feel so strongly about and have all these resources behind, you would think it's another genocide is something that we could prevent. Where that became to be a problem, though, was the Rwanda genocide in 1994. The UN existed. The UN had the ability to intervene, but it didn't because of its bureaucratic bloat. And hundreds of thousands of innocent people died. Not because of the UN, but the UN could have helped them. And then there's how does the UN interact with the United States? Aside from the obvious ways we talked about, like especially in the Security Council. So how does this happen? Well, one of the most obvious interactions between the United States and the UN is the UN ambassador, or United States ambassador to the United Nations. Sort of a rare job that instead of an ambassador to a country, it's a diplomatic post. And not only that, but it's also has to go through Senate confirmation. So the president picks and the Senate confirms. Currently, it's this guy on the left, Mike Waltz. He really doesn't cause that much of a stink, at least within the U.S. side of things. He is normally pretty consistent about being working with President Trump's goals. And there's an old adage in writing that characters get interesting when they say no. And so that's why I put up Nikki Haley, an earlier UN ambassador under Trump's first term. But we'll get into that. And of course, it's one I know a lot more about, being from South Carolina, and before this, she was governor of South Carolina. Another thing to know about South Carolina, though, is that defense contractors are a big deal there. Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Lindsey Graham, all very hawkish, all represent South Carolina. So when someone with all these defense industry ties, who has a history already of being hawkish even as a governor, goes to the UN, what's interesting is this policy deviation between her and the president. This is before the Mueller investigation, so there was a lot of accusations that Russia had rigged the election to allow Trump to win, and that Trump was essentially Putin's lapdog. There's never been evidence of collusion found of that, so it's really just a conspiracy theory and, frankly, cope from the Democrats. But people did notice that Trump had very friendly ties with Putin. He also had friendly ties with Kim Jong-un and Shinzo Abe. But repairing the relationship, or others would say appeasing Russia, I don't think either one of them are particularly wrong. Point being is that there's this path of peace between the United States and Russia that Nikki Haley, who has all these defense industry ties, didn't really go along with. Trying to instigate conflict with Russia a lot of the time. That eventually led to her termination as UN ambassador. As you can see here, there's only been, in the first Trump term, there was only 2 confirmed ambassadors and 2 acting ambassadors, which is already higher than normal. Most presidents just have 1. Obama had 1 per term, Susan Rice and then Samantha Power. I guess you could say Biden had 1 per term also, but that's really just because he only had 1 term. But so far, he could make a comeback. I'd never say never. And so far, Trump has just had Mike Waltz. So we'll see how that goes. I don't know of any friction between Waltz and Trump, so maybe he'll just be it for a while. So some common behaviors of the United States in the UN: less focus on the General Assembly, more focus on the Security Council, because it has more power there. It uses its economic advantage a lot, obviously with funding it a lot, with funding other states and bribing, or I wouldn't say bribing. Hold on, let me take that back. Investing a lot in states that come onto the Security Council, the ones that rotate on. It has economic influence. The other thing is that when it's blocked from doing something, the U.S. can just go off and do its own thing. So sanctions are a big one. There were pushes from President Trump to sanction Iran. Some states with it, a lot didn't. So the U.S. is going to do its own sanctions without the UN. Invasion of Iraq, and as another big one, did not get UN approval. So it has to balance its disproportionate impact on the UN with the equality among member states. So a weird tightrope to walk, right? Then it goes into this wider array of trade-offs where the UN almost gives, or at least gave, the UN the ability to exist, as evidenced by the failure of the League of Nations. It does pay a lot more in funding and security commitments. It allows the HQ to be in New York City, or some would say it demanded the HQ to be in New York City. But at the same time, the UN can launder what would otherwise be unilateral actions from the USA. So the Korean War, for example, was not a US action unilaterally, even if we know it really was based on who was participating in it. So the UN makes the USA look better by at least giving it a seal of approval from the international community. All right, from there we will leave it. I will have the papers posted right after this goes up, so y'all can get a jump on your homework. Questions or comments, hit up my email. And if there is nothing, I look forward to reading your homework and look forward to posting the next class on the rest of the international community on Thursday.